In this video, we're going to talk about deploying software-defined networking on Azure Stack HCI with System Center Virtual Machine Manager. To do so, we'll need a few things. We'll need our physical Hyper-V host with their networking already defined. We'll need a virtual hard drive, and this hard drive is going to be running Azure Stack HCI OS in a separate manner, and this will be used for our SDN infrastructure VMs that we'll need. The SDN packages are all located on our GitHub page, and so these include SDN Express that we'll use for PowerShell, Admin Center, or in our case, Virtual Machine Manager with service templates. We'll need two security groups, NC users and NC admins for the permissions. We'll need a log location to drop our log files for analysis troubleshooting. SDN requires dynamic DNS registration, so we'll need to make the permissions available on DNS for the SDN computer group. Because we're using VMM, we're using Kerberos authentication, so we have to make some service provider name changes in Active Directory. We'll need 4 routable networks from our network engineers. And once we are ready to go, we'll have a switch embedded team that's deployed via any number of ways, PowerShell, Admin Center, or in our case, with logical networks in VMM. You'll need a certificate, either self-signed or root CA, doesn't matter. And then we're ready to deploy this out onto our Hyper-V host so that we can have network controller VMs that are highly available and interactive between VMM or Windows Admin Center to our SDN switches. So those networks include things like the management network, and this is how Hyper-V, the network controller, the software load balancer, and the gateway VMs talk to the domain. We have a provider backend network that we use for software-defined networking exclusively, and this also allows communication between the router and the SDN infrastructure components. We have a public or a private VIP pool that is used for internet and intranet load balancing to our virtual machines in our tenant networks. And if we're using gateways, we can use a GRE virtual IP pool if we decide to use a GRE tunnel, and that would be a requirement. So these 4 networks have to be created and routable in our physical layer. Now when it comes to deploying SDN, we have 2 major routes. We have SDN Express via PowerShell or Admin Center, and we can manage it with Windows Admin Center on Azure Stack HCI. The other method is Virtual Machine Manager. And if you're familiar with VMM, you're familiar with all of its aspects, including VM templates, multiple cluster management, and so forth. VMM is a System Center product that a lot of enterprises like. The choice is, when you're deploying SDN, it's very important to know which matters which, right? So deploying SDN with VMM means you can only manage it with VMM. Deploying it with SDN Express means you can manage it via PowerShell or Admin Center. The choice is yours, but that decision is very, very important. Today we're going to talk about it from a VMM perspective, but other videos will talk about it from an SDN or Admin Center perspective as well. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to dive into deploying this with Virtual Machine Manager. Now, this cluster that I have already has SDN running, so I'm just going to show you the setup steps that you would take to deploy it. I've already got it working, so I don't need to tear it down and redeploy it, but we can show you what you have to do. So the first thing we're going to start with is a logical network and a host group. So I like to separate my SDN environment by a host group in VMM. So we're going to create a logical network, and that logical network is going to be a one connected network. This is all explained in the documentation on docs.microsoft. So we'll give the logical network a name, and this is our management network, one of our 4 required networks. We're going to choose a connected network. It's not managed by the NC because it is for the NCs itself. We're not using independent networks, VLAN from our network admins, or we're not using a software-defined network because we're building the foundation for that. So we'll continue on with our network, and we'll start defining our site. Now, a site is a logical separation. It could be a data center, it could be a life cycle, whatever you choose. In our case, we're logically separating SDN managed Hyper-V host from other hosts or clusters in our environment. We'll provide a VLAN, and you saw me put VLAN 10, but in this case, it's a native VLAN. So we really want to default no VLAN tag. Provide the subnet, and we'll create that logical network. We could create an IP pool, and because of VMM 2019, I could have done it in the last step, but you can also create it separately here in the GUI. So we'll go ahead and create an IP pool for our management network, which is our SDN logical network for the host for the virtual machines that we're using. Not our tenant VMs, just the SDN components. We'll give it a range. We'll give it a gateway, because this network is routable. This is a physical network in our infrastructure. We'll provide DNS because we are joining the domain, so we'll want that information provided. And then wins, right? So the logical network is created. The next step is to create a port profile. Now, port profile links the uplink to the virtual world, or the physical adapters to the virtual world in our Hyper-V host. So we'll give it a name, and we're selecting an uplink port profile with the host default load balancing algorithm. But in our case, Hyper-V would be a really good selection as well. And the switch independent. We always want to go switch independent. We're not going with LACP in this case. After that, we will deploy a logical switch. And so the logical switch is where we're going to build our embedded team that we will apply to our host. We have to use an embedded team. An LBFO team or load balance failover team is not available for SDN. It requires an embedded team. So it's very important that you choose that. And if you're doing HCI, you're going to go with an embedded team anyway. It's kind of the natural way for you to do this. We'll choose our QoS by weight. We're not going to do absolute because we're going to have varying different types of traffic. We don't need any filters. I'm also going to add in a port classification. This is used for hardware, software, and security acceleration technologies like RSS, RDMA, things like that. So I'm going to go ahead and apply that, and this is going to be my default classification for this traffic. I'm then going to create the embedded team switch and the virtual network adapters that are on top of that. So we'll create one switch, and then the first network adapter is management. It'll inherit the IP address, and we'll classify that as management. So that'll be the IP address of our team. Now, I haven't actually applied this to host yet, so the next step is to. I don't have any hosts that are not already provisioned, so I'll just show you what this would look like on another cluster. So you go to properties of the node, you go to the virtual switch, and then you would apply a new logical switch. You'll then select your physical adapters in that team, and you'll see that it'll apply those virtual network adapters. You'll do this by the host group and the hosts that are in that host group. So once all the networking is done, we can start actually getting ready to deploy our provider address network. So this is the second required logical network. So the provider network links the SDN components with the routers and with interconnection communication. So it is a connected network, and it is our very first virtualized network. So this is managed by SDN v2, right? It's an SDN version 2 product. So we'll provide a network site. It'll be most likely the same site. That makes sense, right? And this will be a trunked VLAN that we've provided. In our case, 10.10.11.0 is our subnet. And in this case, we're also going to go ahead and create an IP pool while we're here. So let me go back and do that. So we'll create an IP pool in one swipe. We'll clean up the name. Provide a starting IP address and an ending IP address range. In our case, we don't want to give the full range. We're just going to give a subset of that. And then we can provide things like gateway and DNS, although it doesn't have to be because this is only for intra-VM traffic, right? So I'll go ahead and do that anyway. So I've provided that. So now we're ready to import the service templates and start the deployment process. Oh, that failed. It's because I already have SDN working in this lab, so we'll just have to move on past that, and this will just be part of what we already have, right? So now we're going to go into our library. So we needed the service templates. We get those from GitHub, and so those are constantly being up to date. Those are open source. They're not a product by Microsoft. They are just a project Microsoft engineers. So we'll go to the GitHub SDN and we'll start that download process for the tools. But looking here, you can see in VMM, we have our templates that Greg has been updating. And in our case, we're looking at the NC, and you can see all the components, including the XML, which is what has all the template requirements. So we'll go back to the master and we'll download that zip file and we'll bring that over to our VMM library. So I'm moving over to my VMM library. You can see I have a folder. Bring it up here in a second. So if we go to my library drive, go into my shared library in VMM, I have an SDN folder. Down the path, there's SDN master, just like we saw, VMM, templates, and the NC. We're going to import one of these, right? And then you can see the components of there. So I'll have to copy the certificate that I need into the server certificate.custom resource. The NC certificate.custom resource will need one as well. If I'm doing a trusted root, I'll need to put one in the edge, but in the case I'm not doing that. So you can see that. So I'll start by importing the template. I'll select the one that makes the most sense to me. Let's move up to the NC. So I'm going to select a production generation 2, which means it's going to deploy 3 VMs by default, and you'll see where we can configure that. It's going to ask me some requirements for references. So there's that VHD that has Azure Stack HCI already sysprepped and ready to go. There's the NC setup folder. So I'm going to point to the NC setup custom resource. And then the server certificates custom resource. Oh, looks like I chose the wrong one. Let me fix that real quick. And that'll be that server certificate. So these are going to be copied over, and I'll show you where you can find that information out. So that's importing that certificate in. And then there are some configurations from the prereqs that I need for VMM. So that's the next step I'm going to do. So we're going to go to our service template. We're going to go to the properties of that service template. And I'm going to go to the server settings. Now, when you deploy this, you can be asked all these questions. Or if you've done this quite a bit, you can come in here and start populating the values that are not encrypted. So in my case, I know what my REST endpoint is going to be. ncluster.mydomain. Right? I know what my management security group is. So this is those prerequisites I went over at the beginning of this video. So NC admins, there's my fully qualified domain name that will help with the join domain process that I'll have here, and so forth. So you populate these fields. If something is encrypted, you'll have to pass that when you do the actual service deployment. So you don't need to worry about encrypted fields. But anything that's not encrypted, you can go ahead and populate and save in here so you don't have to worry about those later on. Notice we do use run as accounts. So I'm selecting my NC admin run as account that's stored in VMM. I'm going to store my local admin as a run as account, which you probably already have been doing anyway. So pulling that run as account into this process. There's diagnostic, that is optional, so don't feel you have to do that. And then the client security group is another required one. So this is my NC users or the computer clients that will be part of this, the Hyper-V hosts themselves. So we've set these settings. The next step is to open the designer and start customizing the virtual machines, in this case for the network controller role. So we'll get to customize specific features about our network controllers that we're going to deploy. So we're going to open the designer for the service template. And you can see here, here's a normal service template, so one-tier application, right? You can see we have the application order, a custom name, servicing order. We're going to up the instance count. So the best instance count for network controller is actually 5 network controllers. It adds some stability to the Azure Service Fabric. So I'm going to set, I want a minimum of 5, really no less than 3, and a maximum of 8 network controllers. So this will help with scale-out processes. But this first go, we're going to deploy 5 network controllers. Now, on a 2-node cluster, seems a bit silly. But in your real environment, you're probably going to need at least 5 of these. We go to the properties and we can start defining these. And here's those settings again for the instance count. What we're interested in things like hardware configuration. So we can change the memory and the processor. We can change our hard drive so that we're using remote storage. And we're going to go ahead and say we want this to be an HAVM, right? So it's going to be clustered. We want to use that. We can customize the name and randomize it. So this will be NCVM01. If we want to use a product key, we can go ahead and populate that. So normally you would go out and you'd pull the automatic virtual machine activation key. But we're deploying this on Azure Stack HCI OS. Azure Stack HCI doesn't have a requirement to be licensed because the host Azure Stack HCI is licensed. So you don't need an AVMA key, so we're going to move past that. I'm going to set my time zone. And if you had any roles or features like Windows Server Backup or anything like that, in our case, RSAT AD PowerShell is what we need. Now, the meat of this is in the application config. Now, I'm going to go ahead and say that this is a Windows 2019 data center. Azure Stack HCI isn't a recognized operating system by VMM yet. It is for the host. It's not for the virtual machines. Well, you're not really meant to, but in this case, you do for SDN. So we're going to go back to that application config. We're compatible with 2019, but what's really happening is these steps here. So you can see pre-install step 1 is going to copy the certificate from server certificate. The trusted root certificate is going to be copied over in step 2. Step 3, we're going to run prepared network controller. So where is that at? So if we go back to our template file from SDN Express that we got on GitHub, you'll see that the template has these PowerShell and command line scripts involved, and they're all in that NC setup folder. So there's prepare node for network controller.ps1. This is what's actually happening after the VM is deployed and joined to the domain. So you can see all the variables it's running and see every step of the process. Here we're going to do install network controller, and that's going to install the NC role, and then we're going to scale out a node. So if this is the second, third, fourth, fifth node, it's going to just run the scale out command and not create the cluster. The last two are for maintenance tasks later on in the life cycle, but you get the idea. So we'll go ahead and save this, and we'll have our service template prepared and customized, ready to go. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to configure that deployment. I'm having a little bit of trouble. It's because I already have things in working, so I'm not really too concerned about it, but that gets you through a general idea of the process. So you'll configure a deployment, you'll give the service a name, you'll pick your host group you want to send it to, and you'll select that management logical network that we created earlier. Right? So this is the network that has domain access. We'll allow these things to become part of the domain and talk to the Hyper-V host. So after you've gone through the deployment process, you'll see that you now have a service. I have it fully deployed, so I have my NC service. It's comprised of one VM here in the lab scenario. And if we, there's our configurement. I didn't want that. Never mind that. You can see here's my NC, which is nc.mydomain, and we can interact with that. So we can scale it out. But in this case, I have an instance count of 1, and that really wouldn't do me any good because I don't have an NC cluster that supports that. But had I done a multi-node or a production, I could scale out and add additional nodes. I could start, stop the VM, migrate it, whatever I need to do from here in the service. Now the last thing, once my NC is fully deployed, the service is fully deployed, I'm going to go into the network service and add that in as a fully functional member of VMM. And this is where VMM starts to talk to the SDN world. So I'm going to use that run as account for the permission, NC admin, and I'm going to provide things like services. In our case, we're looking at the connection string. So we're telling VMM how to contact the NC service through REST API. So we're using the server URL, which is nc.mydomain in this case, that we define, and then the service name. Well, that service name is specific to your VMM deployment. And so that service name is, in my case, NC. And so there you have it. That's deploying the network controller via Virtual Machine Manager.